Hello, everybody. Back on March the 31st of this year, we had my old friend Pete Wehner on the show talking about what he described as the ethical darkness that had fallen or has fallen on America because of Donald Trump. I've always considered Peter Wehner to be the moral conscience, certainly of American Christianity, of American conservatism. And in that article, the five key takeaways included revenge as Trump's driving force and the spread of moral corruption and the deep lying existence of what he described as religious hypocrisy. It was a broad conversation, but I think in a narrower, more empirical sense, it's brought into context in terms of something Peter Wehner has just written for The Atlantic, why evangelicals turn their back on PEPFAR, a religious movement that has so often taken public stands, has been unusually quiet since Trump gutted the program to combat AIDS in Africa. And I'm thrilled and honored, as always, to have Peter Wehner on the show. Pete, is that fair that your conversation with me is certainly not the only one you've made about the ethical darkness fallen on America? But in terms of those generalized arguments, PEPFAR is a very good example of that moral darkness.
Yeah, I think it is, Andrew. It's one of the things that strikes me about PEPFAR. It's the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which President Bush introduced in 2003, and since then had broad bipartisan support until the Trump administration saved estimates are 26 million lives in Africa. Just to set the context of the discussion. So, what does the ending of PEPFAR, or at least the crippling of PEPFAR, say about Donald Trump and his administration? All of it is bad, and all of it is dark. And the reason that I say that is that this program, which costs about 0.08% for the federal budget, so it was really pocket change, especially in light of the explosive spending we're seeing in the newest bill that Trump passed. And it was a program that was really renowned for its efficiency and accountability. It was working. It was working really, really well. It was saving millions and millions of lives. And the Trump administration, particularly Elon Musk and his kiddies over at Doge, decided to go after both the USAID, which is an agency, and they crippled it and destroyed it. I think what they did was unconstitutional in doing that. And it was done really with no forethought. And in the process, they have gutted and done enormous damage to PEPFAR. And this, to me, was an act of wanton cruelty. You really had to go out of your way to think, how can I kill millions of people quickly and efficiently? And they found one way to do it, which is to shutter USAID, which is the main implementing agency for PEPFAR, and then to do what they've done to PEPFAR. So there was no need to do this. There was no fiscal need to do it. There was certainly no humanitarian need to do it. It was quite the opposite, and yet they did it anyway. And they did it with lust and with delight. And then in the process, they decided to spread lie after lie after lie about USAID and the people who work there. So yeah, I think it is one example of a number of examples of an administration that is both malicious and malevolent.
Pete, we've had many conversations over the years. I don't think I've ever seen you quite as angry or as outraged by this. As you note in your piece, more than 75,000 adults and children are now estimated to have died because of the effective shutdown of PEPFAR. You're saying quite explicitly then that Musk and the Doge people, and particularly Trump, have not just blood on their hands, but the blood of 75 million innocent Africans. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, that is what I'm saying. I'm saying there will be a lot more before this is done. There will be millions of people. And
we're already talking about millions. We're talking about 75. I apologize, 75,000. So
Since that executive order.
Right. So let's quantify this. I know it can be a little crass, but how many people are dying a week or a month?
Well, I can actually cite it in the essay because I want to be precise on the numbers. And so what they say is that there is an adult being lost every 3 minutes, a child every 31 minutes, and ending PEPFAR could result in as many as 11 million additional new HIV infections and nearly 3 million additional AIDS-related deaths by the end of the decade. And just to add to that, Andrew, a study came out in Lancet, the British medical journal, and the study shows that the elimination of USAID could contribute to 14 million deaths in the next 5 years. So we're talking really, really significant numbers. And that's an enormous amount of death, an enormous amount of suffering, and it's completely unnecessary. Again, they went out of their way to do this. There was no argument to do it. It was an act of wanton cruelty.
So just to be even more concrete, perhaps crass, I'm looking at my screen now. We've been talking now for a little over 6 minutes, Pete, and in that period then, for our audience, people watching and listening, two Africans, probably African people, have died because of this overt decision to essentially murder people, Pete. It's a little disconcerting, isn't it? I'm not sure whether we should be talking here. Maybe we should just have some silence.
Yeah, no, silence is not a bad response for people of faith. Prayer is not a bad response. It's almost mind-boggling.
Yeah, I mean, it's more than mind-boggling. I mean, if we had Trump on the show, he wouldn't come on, and even if he did, I'm not sure I'd want him on. But he would come up with some sort of gobbledygook response. And I mean, the best defense of Trump is that he's about as clueless as anybody else on this. He doesn't understand what he's doing. Is that a fair defense?
No, not when you're president. This is a kind of issue which has been raised publicly. So you'd have to go out of your way not to be aware of it. No, if a person has pushed this agenda and then, as I said, pushed lies about, in this case, USAID, then you're complicit in it. Are you as complicit as Elon Musk and Marco Rubio? Arguably no with Musk. I'm not sure about Rubio and the others there, but no, he's the author of this, and this is not sui generis when it comes to Trump. I mean, it's part of his entire personality. I would say, if I were really to detach myself, Andrew, from this and say what would be the strongest defense of Donald Trump, I think the strongest defense of Donald Trump is that he's a sociopath and that he does not have the capacity to see right and wrong, or morality and immorality. That morality is to him what color is to a person who's colorblind, or what sounds are to a person who's deaf. And so I think his disordered personality is something that has to be taken into account to explain the vastness of his cruelty. That I don't think can be said about many of the people around him.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually kind of agree and kind of disagree in terms of that colorblindness, because he isn't a moral person. He sees everything either in moral or non-moral terms, just according to his own interests. So another defense he might have is it was George W. Bush who created PEPFAR, and Trump's response might be, in the way in which he only ever punches below the belt, is to suggest that, well, Bush killed many more people in Iraq and all those dumb wars in the Middle East. Is there any truth to that? I mean, if you want to quantify these things, Bush, some people would argue, has more blood on his hands than Donald Trump.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, if you just want to be straight empirical, 25 million people didn't die in the Iraq and Afghanistan war. So that's number one. Number two, of course, you can argue that the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were wrong, but these are separate tracks, separate programs. So what the argument that because if you believe Bush was wrong on Iraq and Afghanistan, therefore you ought to destroy everything he did, including a program that saved 26 million lives. Uh, you can make that argument. It's morally imbecilic, I think, to do it. So I don't think it's a defense. I mean, if you had Trump on, would he say that? I doubt even he would say that. I imagine what he would do is just spread lies, and he would say that the program was a haven of wokeness and was inefficient, and that's just not true. But of course, he's a pathological liar. So I think he would say that, and then beyond that, I think he would probably argue the America first. This is none of their business, none of our business. We've got to take care of our country. We have no responsibility to take care of people on foreign continents. And thirdly, Andrew, and I think he probably would make this to some people in his coalition, not all, but there's an element of MAGA that would say, yeah, and remember that this is a continent with black people as well. He referred to those countries, you'll remember, in his first term, I believe, as SHIT, whole countries, and so that's how he views things. I don't think it's a revelation to say that. So I think those are part of the things that's going on. Again, with Trump, I mean, I certainly would be open to the argument that he's ignorant a lot of what's going on, but that's not an
Yeah, I think that
excuse.
kind of goes without saying. I don't think that's news.
But his people weren't and aren't and shouldn't be, and they have to be held accountable. You can do a lot of damage in the name of ignorance, and ignorance is not the only thing at play here when it comes to Donald Trump.
And that's the point of your piece. It's less focused on Trump and more on why evangelicals turn their back on PEPFAR. Right. You have a long history of involvement, Pete, with the American evangelical movement. It's a broad movement. You quit it publicly in 2017 with an interesting piece, controversial piece in the Times, Why I Can No Longer Call Myself an Evangelical Republican. Right. How surprised are you by the fact that the evangelicals have turned their back on PEPFAR? I mean, what would have to happen for and we've asked this, you and I have had this conversation before, and I'm sure you've had it with many other people. What would Trump have to do to get the evangelicals to turn their back on him?
Well, there's nothing Donald Trump can do to have evangelicals turn their back.
Nothing?
No.
I mean, even if you put them all in jail?
Maybe, but he's. I guess if we got creative, we could come up with something. Let me frame it this way. I think it is closer to a cult of personality than it is to a normal political party. Now, every president has deep loyalties and ties to his base and vice versa. We saw that, with Richard Nixon and Watergate. Even at the worst of Watergate, there were still a lot of Republicans, according to the polls, that supported him. So that's a given. It's the nature of politics, nature of human beings, human life. But the degree to which we see that with Donald Trump and Republicans is unlike anything that I've ever seen. I think in some senses the truest thing Donald Trump said in the 2016 campaign was when he said that he could go on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and he wouldn't lose support. And I think that turned out to be not hyperbole, but prophetic.
Although he probably should have said, I mean, think if he's a New Yorker, so you're thinking Fifth Avenue, he probably should have said he could have gone into an evangelical church and shot someone and got away.
Yeah. So I just, there's, I could, given the time, I could list dozens and dozens and dozens of examples throughout the Trump era where I heard from any number of people, privately and publicly, who said, "Well, that's finally it. They're going to take the exit ramp." A lot of people thought that would happen when he inspired an insurrection against the Capitol, and it didn't. And even, interestingly, even Republicans. Like the Speaker of the House thought that Republicans would turn on him after January 6th, And Kevin McCarthy was wrong, and within days, weeks, he was going hand in hand to Mar-a-Lago. Why was that? It was because Trump's grip on the party was beyond even what leading politicians in the Republican Party understood. I don't think that's been properly seen for many, many years during the Trump era. I think it's pretty clear now that his hold on the party is unlike anything that we've ever seen. He says jump, and his base, including evangelicals, say how high, sir, and they'll basically do whatever he does. They'll justify anything he does, and they'll shift their positions in the blink of an eye if necessary, because by definition, whatever Donald Trump does deserves to be defended.
Did you, for this piece, I know you're still well connected, and I know the piece quotes a number of prominent evangelicals. Did you talk directly to a number of prominent American evangelicals about this particular issue and your stats on the 75,000 adults and children who are now estimated to have died because of the shutdown of PEPFAR?
I did. I certainly spoke to, prominent evangelicals and non-prominent evangelicals, pastors. I spoke to or heard from almost 30 of them from around the country in different positions. As I said, a lot of pastors, some of them in parachurch organizations and other kinds of ministries. So I've heard from them, and then I checked with experts on PEPFAR in terms of the data that was used, and so yeah, that was a lot of the piece is reporting, and as you said, it's actually the focus is really less on Trump, and I've written about him any number of times, and I'm happy to speak to him. But to me, what I wanted to do with this essay is explore the issue of why evangelicals would be so silent in the face of mass death and mass suffering. And I wanted it to be a balanced piece, and I wanted to try and capture the complexity of what I heard, because it wasn't simply a case that white evangelicals and the pastors that I spoke for, Trump supporters, or wake up in the morning thinking, how many Black Africans can I kill today? That isn't the case. So it's more complicated than that. But I also wanted to get at what I thought was a core moral point, which is this is happening, and very, very few white evangelicals are saying anything about it. There's very little to no mobilization on this issue. And that to me is a window into a world that I know extremely well, and a faith that I am a part of, the Christian faith. And it's troubling. It's kind of haunting, really.
To put it mildly, I mean, the title of the piece in The Atlantic is Why Evangelicals Turn Their Back on PEPFAR. But maybe a more appropriate title, Pete, would be Why Evangelicals? ? I mean, what makes them in any way Christian in July of 2025?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Andrew. And in some ways, it's a deep question, and it doesn't have a simple answer to it. And the reason I say that is, even within the spectrum of American Christianity, let alone worldwide Christianity, the definition of what is a Christian varies. It's not necessarily that they would argue about certain aspects, but there would be weight and emphasis and accent that differs. A lot of people, their first response, this would be true of fundamentalists and a lot of evangelicals, would be a doctrinal view, which is the deity of Christ, how they view the Bible. Particularly for conservative evangelicals, do you view the Bible as inerrant, is the phrase that's often used, without error, without contradiction, and so forth. And the resurrection, the crucifixion. So there would be a whole series of those questions. The creeds, right? There are a whole series of key creeds throughout Christianity where people say, do you agree with that or not? If you don't, you may be a very fine person, but you probably don't qualify as a Christian. Then there's the issue of the outworking of that faith, works, not just faith. And I think your question gets more to that latter part, which is, if you call yourself a Christian, if you claim to be a follower of Jesus, and either in your own life you are acting in a way that is antithetical to a Jesus ethic, to the teachings of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, and all the rest, or if you are part of movements that are antithetical to Christianity, at what point does that call into question your faith? That can be a complicated question, because there are a lot of movements, where political movements, cultural movements, and others, where people could have honest differences of opinion. There may be some objectively true answer to movements you should be a part of and not a part of. But, some people could say if you're a Democrat, you can't be a Christian because they're stand on abortion. So you could have that. On the other hand, if you were part of the Christian movement that was dominant in Germany in the 1930s, which was overwhelmingly, or at least largely, supportive of Nazism, and the Confessional Church, led by Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, had a role in this. They broke, but they failed because they were a minority. So there you have a spectrum of organizations and stands and movements you can be a part of. I think for the most part, the reflex should be, you can be parts of all sorts of different movements, still be a follower of Jesus. You could be wrong on them, but that doesn't disqualify your faith. But I do think most people would also say, at some point you've crossed a line, and if you're part of Nazism, and claiming to be a Christian, that's something of a problem.
Right, as borrowing from Einstein, these issues shouldn't be that complicated. It may be quite complicated to determine what being a Christian is, but not that complicated. When it becomes that complicated, it's no longer a coherent question. You're very clear on this. You believe that this is a Christian question. You end your Atlantic piece by referring to Jesus Christ, and you end, Jesus knew such people in his time. These were people who were dying of AIDS. And helping those people who were dying. They were religious figures who, when they saw that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, passed to the other side. So this is not just a Christian issue or narrative, but a very traditional one, and then in the way it separates supposed believers. Is that fair, Pete?
It's an interesting way that you frame it. I guess the way I would say is that it's a really important issue to me, and in some cases it could be a threshold issue to me. I'm not prepared to say that someone that doesn't agree with me on the importance of PEPFAR or USAID, doesn't share my views, or isn't willing to speak out, isn't a Christian. I wouldn't go that far, as I do think, and this was part of what the essay explored, there are different reasons that people may not do it. I do think, Andrew, that if I had a conversation with a Christian and laid out to him the facts and the realities as we know it, and that person still enthusiastically embraced the destruction of PEPFAR and USAID, knowing the human costs, that would be hard. Now, I understand. I've been around Trump supporters and MAGA supporters enough to know how their mind works, and I know what would happen in that conversation. There would be cognitive dissonance. They would deny the facts. They would come up with an entire series of rationalizations, because people don't live easily with cognitive dissonance. And if I'm dealing with people who are genuinely Christians or believe themselves to be Christians, I'm talking here about people who go to church 3 or 4 times a month, who are part of a Bible study, who read the Bible, study commentaries on the Bible, and listen to Christian music. If the whole array of different things that they can do. So I'm talking about not cynics. I'm about people that if you gave them sodium pentothal would say, of course I'm a follower of Jesus. I think those people would have a hard time owning the fact that they are supporting something this catastrophic. So I think they would come up with a lot of explanations and rationalizations and invoke authorities that aren't true. But at the end of the day, I guess, Andrew, what I struggle with is, at what point do you become willingly complicit in the lies? That you really don't take the time to examine it with a conscience. Say, you know, I may be wrong. Let me look at this source, or maybe the sources that I'm listening to are not right. Or even being able to say, look, I think Donald Trump is terrific on the border, and I love what he's doing to Harvard University. But sure, I'll grant you that on PEPFAR and USAID, this is really wrong, and it shouldn't happen. They don't, by and large, there's some exceptions, of course, but by and large, they can't do that. It is as if they are completely and fully in, that they've thrown their hat over the wall. And having become a supporter of Trump, they can't admit at any point along the way of his failures. And I would add one other psychological element in here, which I think can't be discounted, Andrew, and that is the sense that the people that I hate him. And so the bonding to Trump is, I think, at least originally, was less of an affirmative, positive bonding than it was a negative bonding. That is, the vengeance and the cruelty that he embodies toward the people that they hate was a kind of psychic, gave them a kind of psychic satisfaction. And it created a very, very deep bond. Now, since then, I think it's gotten even more complicated. And they've been won over by the Trump ethic. They take great delight, for a lot of people in MAGA world and Republicans. I think it's almost weirdly life-giving and life-affirming to see Trump practice his brand of cruelty. So it's a complicated matter, and I think it's tragic too. But there's a real human cost to these mistakes.
Yeah, they've turned it into a biblical narrative, but maybe an Old Testament one. What is it about this issue, Pete, that is you keep on coming back to? You and I have had these sorts of conversations before. As I said, in 2017, you quit being an evangelical Republican. You've quit being a Republican as well. Some people might be watching this and thinking, none of this surprises us. In fact, I would expect nothing else of the evangelicals. What is it about this issue that disturbs you so personally? There seems to be a kind of an inner biblical quality to this narrative for you yourself.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight, Andrew. This one has touched me in a way that other issues have not. And I've been quite outspoken in my criticisms of Trump and Trump supporters. And I've had people comment. I've been on Zoom calls where I've been talking to people about this issue over months, really since that executive order came down at the beginning of his term. And people have said that, for me, I'm unusually emotional about it, because I tend not to be. My emotional equanimity is probably a characteristic of me, not because it's a virtue, it's just how I'm wired. But in this one, this has touched me rather deeply. Why it has, I mean, I'm not exactly sure, except for the fact, or at least in part for the fact, that the suffering and the death is on such a mass scale, and it was so unnecessary. And it destroyed something which, prior to Trump, everybody agreed, Republicans and Democrats, it was doing great work. It was, in a sense, removed from so much of the politics that had happened. It united, even at the beginning of PEPFAR, someone like Jesse Helms was won over by Bono, who was such an instrumental figure in the beginning of PEPFAR. And Democrats were stepped up. And President Bush, of course, pushed this harder than anybody. And so to see that destruction, to know something about the measure of pain and grief and death that will happen, and then the kind of celebration that seems to accompany this, all of that together is just a terrible offense to me. And I can't honestly understand why it's not an offense to almost everybody. And especially, I guess, given my history and given the people that Christians claim to follow, Jesus, why this doesn't hit them harder than than it does, but it doesn't.
You mentioned Jesse Helms. Another way of framing or headlining this piece was why Republicans turn their back on PEPFAR. You touch on this in the piece, but would it be fair to say that you mentioned Rubio, who seems to become increasingly a puppet of Trump?
Yeah.
Have the Republicans turned their back on PEPFAR as much as the evangelicals? Are there Republicans who are you're no longer a Republican, but still you're friendly with a lot of Republicans? Are there Republicans who are saying, hold on a minute, we agree, yeah, on Harvard, maybe on the border, but on this PEPFAR thing, we don't agree?
There are a few, I think, but they're silent. I think some of them are working behind the scenes to undo the damage that's been done to see if they can get this thing reversed. But they are very few in number. They have very limited influence. And honestly, Andrew, we've gone through this, 100 times. You see it with Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins and Bill Cassidy and, the supposedly sane Republicans, normies, as they're referred to. Eventually, Donald Trump breaks almost all of them. And those that he doesn't break leave the party or are thrown out of the party, like Liz Cheney or Mitt Romney or Adam Kinzinger. So Republicans have turned on it as evangelicals have turned on it. I mean, in a way, you can almost say, not quite, but you can almost say that evangelicals and Republicans are virtually synonymous. Regular church-going evangelicals voted for Trump in higher numbers than non-regular church-going evangelicals, and basically 82% voted for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. So it's not quite synonymous, but it's close. It's close to it. So a lot of people are complicit in this tragedy and this this pain and the suffering.
You're obviously very emotional about this, Peter. As I said, I've never seen you quite as emotional. Some people, again, might be watching this, Democrats, thinking to themselves, well, why isn't he as emotional about the treatment of people on the border, the behavior of ICE, these heartrending stories of young children being sent back, of the breaking up of family? I'm not suggesting you're not, but you haven't been quite as outspoken on that. Is that, if not a fair criticism, one that you've at least given some thought to?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. For sure. And my response to it is, yeah, it's a fair critique. I'm not sure if it's a criticism, but it's a fair critique. I'd say a couple of things in response to it, Andrew. One of them is that every human being has a limited capacity to how much pain they can feel in the world they see unfold about them, how many causes they can care about, how many things they weigh in on. There's just a limit to that. So that's one. A second is that certain people in life, because of their circumstances, are called to do different things and say different things at different moments. Third is, I feel pretty strongly on a lot of those issues that you've mentioned, and I'm happy to talk about them, and I've written about them. So it's not as if I'm exactly silent on the other issues and speaking out on PEPFAR. The fourth thing I'd say, and in some respects, I think this is probably the main response that I would highlight, is that we're talking about here, in terms of the destruction of PEPFAR and USAID, is the magnitude of the suffering and the lack of real controversy there should be about the programs themselves, certainly with PEPFAR, and the good that it has done. I can understand if you care about what's happening in Ukraine, and I do. And speaking about that, there are civil wars in Africa. You could go back to the Rwandan genocide. I mean, there are a lot of things that people could speak out on. So I give people space and room to be able to say that. But by the way, I should say I interviewed a close friend of mine. I knew him in high school and particularly got close to him in college. Scott Dudley is a wonderful pastor at Bellevue Presbyterian Church in Bellevue, Washington. And Scott, when I pose these questions to pastors, including Scott, why so little is said about PEPFAR? Um, Scott is a strong supporter of PEPFAR, but he said, look, we're already involved in ministries with immigrants and people who are dying in Africa for other reasons, and refugees and so forth. And so they've kind of, they don't have a lot of bandwidth for doing more. And I understand that, and I accept that. And Scott is someone I admire very, very much. So I take that into account. I'm just saying, generally speaking, that if you did a thought experiment and said, what kind of program or what kind of action by a president would you think is most morally repulsive? I would say that the destruction of PEPFAR would meet the criteria if you went with the mass suffering that it would inflict, the mass death that it would inflict, the fact that the program is so effective, has such a track record of having saved 26 million lives, and was really beyond reproach, and that they went after it for no reason other than apparently the cruelty of
right. And the whole books have been written about the effectiveness of PEPFAR. We even did a show a few years about it. Speaking in religious terms, Pete, what's been the response of other religious groups inside and outside America to the Trump destruction of PEPFAR? From the Roman Catholic Church, Judaism, Islam, and of course African Christian groups. Have they been fairly unified in their condemnation?
Well, I know a lot of Christians in Africa have spoken out, and in fact, they weighed in very, very early after Executive Order 1469, which is the one that Trump signed, went into effect, and there were hundreds of people who wrote making an appeal: stop this, reverse this. So they've spoken out. I've been in touch with people in the United Kingdom, theologians and pastors, who are utterly befuddled, well, generally by the whole Trump evangelical phenomenon. So that's just broadly speaking, but then more narrowly of what's happening in PEPFAR. And a friend of mine who lives in England, actually moving to Scotland now, sent me statements of various Christian groups, evangelical groups in the UK, speaking out. The Catholic Church tends to be better on this particular issue than evangelical churches, because the Catholic Church isn't in Donald Trump's hip pocket like evangelicals. Pastors, rabbis that I've spoken to have very strong opinions about this, and I'm confident. I haven't checked the statements from Jewish groups, but I would guess that they have been more public.
Although they're probably, on a moral sense, slightly preoccupied with other subjects at the moment, but that's another story, another show.
Yeah, but I think they've got the room to speak to this, and certainly the people I know who are rabbis, who have tender hearts, are willing to speak. And I would have interviewed them, except that I telescope this essay toward evangelicals, because it's the world that I know best, and honestly because they carry the most influence politically in America, at least within the Republican Party.
Yeah, you mentioned Musk earlier and his moral responsibility in this. He's since broken with Trump, talking about a third party, but it's hard to imagine him or third party people carrying much of a moral state, a big moral stick in this issue, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the people surrounding Trump and comprising the MAGA movement are it's kind of a moral freak show in a lot of ways. And,
to put it politely, I don't know.
Yeah.
It is a moral. Finally, Pete, there's a broader kind of structural shift in the nature of things in your piece, and it's a must read. Anyone with any sense of any moral doubts about what Trump is doing to the world needs to read Why Evangelicals Turn Their Back on PEPFAR. In your conversations with evangelical leaders in the U.S., you note that some talk about opposition to government involvement, that it's a kind of model for private enterprise. We actually had a show recently with Armin Rosen, who wrote a cover story for Tablet. He went to Kenya and wrote about what Bill Gates is doing in Africa, dedicating his $200 billion to Africa, but also making himself very unpopular. In a broader sense, there's enough moral guilt to go around here, but when one thinks in the long term, what the destruction of PEPFAR means is that the only way Africa is going to get any kind of aid is through billionaires like Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates is a pretty good billionaire, certainly compared to the others, but even in Africa, he's not a particularly popular figure. So all this is doing is compounding these long-term shifts, these structural shifts in how America does aid.
Well, yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is that Bill Gates, you're right, he's one of the good guys, and he's doing a tremendous amount of good work and has for years on global development. And all honor is due to him. Secondly, is if you talk to experts about PEPFAR, who have run PEPFAR, know about PEPFAR, and people in places like South Africa, there are arguments to be made about reform, about handing the baton to some of these countries like South Africa, who could do more than potentially that they have done. So transitions can go. Reforms of PEPFAR, like reforms of USAID, even as eloquent and strong a spokesman and advocate, I would say, not spokesman, but advocate for USAID as Nick Kristof of the New York Times has acknowledged that reforms can happen. So I don't know that too many people that would say that there's not any aspect of either program, USAID or PEPFAR, that couldn't be improved. I think the problem here, Andrew, is that this was like ripping the wires out of the wall. This was just a decision in which they said, we're ending this. We're pausing all foreign assistance. Then they've shuttered USAID, which again is the main implementing agency for PEPFAR. They've crippled PEPFAR. And even if they decided, look, we made a mass mistake on PEPFAR, we want to fully fund it, and let's start USAID again, and that's not going to happen. But even if they wanted to, they've done such massive damage to the infrastructure that it couldn't help, at least for a long time, to come. And as terms of the evangelical argument that was made by some people that I spoke with, they were actually not advocates of this position, but they were articulating a position which was almost generations long distrust of government among a lot of evangelicals because they're Republicans, and because in some respects government should be distrusted. That's a complicated issue on its own, but look, I understand the argument, but what I do not understand, and what I won't let them get away with, is this notion of saying, well, let's do what Trump did, which is the utter decimation of these programs, and have nothing ready to replace it. There's nothing that was in motion. So rather than reform, rather than improvement, it was sheer nihilism. It was sheer destruction for the sake of destruction. And for Christians to come through, and I got a note today, in fact, from a pastor who was entertaining this theory of, oh yes, maybe government shouldn't do this, maybe the churches should do it. My response to that is, well, why the hell haven't the churches done it? Nothing has kept them from adding on to what the government has done with PEPFAR, A. And B, you are now looking at the decimation and gutting of the program. How many churches do you think are going to increase their budgets, their church budgets, to make up for the shortfall now that's happened? How many of them are going to send people to create the infrastructure that's now been utterly obliterated by this administration? The answer is not many. So it's an abstract argument, and there are just too many abstract arguments by Christians who should care about what is going on, and they're silent. Let me conclude with one comparison, which I think is a telling one, Andrew, and in some respects it helps make the point that I think I want to make. having listened to a lot of the pastors and Christians on why evangelicals are silent, some of the reasons are more justified than others. And a number of people asked me in my correspondence with them, what can we do? How would evangelicals mobilize? Does it make any difference? Do you call your congressman or your representative and so forth? And those are completely fair questions. But I end the essay with a comparison. And that is that in 2014, World Vision, which is a humanitarian organization, revered in many ways, certainly by the people who know what they do in terms of their life-saving work over decades. In 2014, World Vision announced that they would hire at some levels of the organization people who were in same-sex marriages. And it was like a bomb going off in the evangelical world. The walls came in. Organizations spoke out. Franklin Graham spoke out. Al Mohler spoke out. This is an attack on biblical authority. Between 3,000 and 3,500 sponsors of kids, primarily in Africa, who had no say in this decision, were ended because of World Vision said it was okay to have people in same-sex marriages to work there. That reaction was immediate, it was ferocious, it was explosive, and within 2 days, World Vision reversed itself because they didn't want to have the children suffer for that decision. And now you have a situation, and we've gone over the numbers about what the destruction of PEPFAR has done and will do. And you can barely get a peep out of them. And that tells you what the order of their loves and the order of their concerns are. And I'm telling you that if Jesus were here now and he saw that comparison, I'm pretty sure I know what his reaction would be. And if I had to bet where his energy and his focus and his compassion and his outrage would be geared toward, it would be toward the millions of innocent people who are dying in Africa, not at an organization that hires same-sex couples to help save kids in Africa.
It's hard to end on a more poignant note than that from Pete Wehner, the author of a central read in the Atlantic right now, Why Evangelicals Turn Their Back on PEPFAR. I think it encapsulates the cruelty and stupidity of the Trump administration. Pete, as always, an honor to talk to you. Keep writing, keep thinking. We need you as our moral conscience in America in 2025. So keep well, and we'll talk again in the not too distant